Thanks everyone for joining our webinar today. We're going to be talking about what's on the ballot in the East Bay. We're going to give it until about 12:05 to allow for some late arrivals. So hang tight and we'll get started shortly. All right, everyone, it is 12:05, so we're going to go ahead and get things started. I thank you all for joining us today for TechEquity's What's on the Ballot East Bay webinar. We're going to dig into the measures that are on the ballot this year in Oakland, Berkeley, and beyond. I'm really excited to jump into these issues. I'm Megan Abell. I'll be facilitating today's conversation. I act as TechEquity's Director of Advocacy, and I'm joined by my colleague, Ian Perry, who's TechEquity's policy manager, who will help to give us all of the nitty-gritty details on each of the measures that we'll cover today. We will have the Q&A open at the end of this conversation to take audience questions. So if you have a question about any of the measures that we cover, go ahead and drop them into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen as we go throughout the conversation, and we'll answer those questions at the end. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and dive right in. Before we get into measures, I think it's really important for us to frame the conversation and to talk about TechEquity's work and how we view the issues that we'll discuss today. TechEquity was created to be a place for tech workers and tech companies to come and learn more about the challenges facing our communities, to understand what impactful engagement can look like, and to contribute to solutions in partnership with the broader community. So our goal is to change the conditions in which the tech sector is growing, and we remain optimistic about the tech industry's potential to drive broad-based growth and opportunity that's accessible to everyone. However, we think that those changes won't happen on their own, and we need to engage tech workers and tech companies to create the changes that are necessary to drive equitable growth in the tech economy. And this really goes beyond the decisions that any one company or individual can make, although the decisions that you make are important and the vote that you'll cast is important. In making bold, comprehensive policy change that is necessary to ensure opportunity and prosperity is created by our industry and can benefit everyone in our community. So that's why TechEquity advances ambitious policy initiatives in our two issue areas, housing and workforce and labor policy. And we really view these areas as being key to creating an equitable tech-driven economy, and we find them to be very interlinked. We can't advance one without the other, because where you're able to live affects your access to opportunity, and what kind of job you have affects where you're able to afford to live. So these two issues really go hand in hand in our view. We do this work on our policy platforms in three key ways. We help tech workers approach these big problems and engage in system change through education. In order to act effectively, we think you need to be really engaged on the issues that are at play here. And so events like the one we're having today play a key role in that. We also activate you on a policy agenda that results in a more inclusive economy in our communities. And we connect tech workers on a personal level to the community where you live and the people who live there sort of outside of our bubble. Over the last 3 years, we've been building this network of tech workers. We're excited about the opportunity that we have to engage with issues facing our community. We've done a lot of work in the last few years. These are just a few sort of photo highlights. One of which that I'm incredibly proud of was tech workers engaging to pass the Tenant Protection Act of 2019 last year. You can see Governor Newsom signing that bill in the upper left corner. And that was really a landmark moment for us to move forward that policy. So with that, I'm gonna turn it over.
It was a year ago today that was actually signed by the governor. So
oh, wow. I didn't even realize it was our anniversary. But with that, I'm actually going to turn it over to you, Ian Eve, to introduce yourself and to give us a little bit of framing around this election in particular.
Thanks, Megan. So, hey, everyone. I'm Ian Eve Perry. I'm the policy manager here at TechEquity, and I'm going to be walking you through the ballot measures that East Bay voters are going to decide this year. So let's just start out with what's on the ballot this November. I think we all know the presidential races on there and our races for US House of Representatives. There's a bunch of state legislature races, both in the Assembly and the Senate. And we've already talked in some of our previous webinars about the state ballot measures. And today, now we're here on the local ones. And I think it's really important, and I'm really glad that you're all here today to learn about the local ballot measures, because especially in an election like this where there's so much going on and there's so much attention paid to the kind of top of the ballot, some of the local ballot measures can slip through the cracks. But we know that those are really important on affecting life and issues that play a big role in our local community. So thank you so much for coming today, and let's get started talking about those ballot measures. Before we go into the specific ones, I just want to give you a few general rules to keep in mind when you're thinking about making your decision on a ballot measure. So usually a ballot measure passes by a simple majority vote, which means 50% of the vote plus one. There's a few exceptions to that, which if they come up, we'll talk about today, where certain types of ballot measures require a higher majority to pass. The other thing to know about ballot measures are, generally speaking, if they pass, they get locked in. Ballot measures are different than laws passed by the legislature in that it's usually a lot more difficult to amend them down the road without going through the ballot process once again, which is lengthy, expensive, and hard to do. So knowing that, a big question to ask yourself is, should this ballot question actually be on the ballot? Basically, like, is this something that the voters need to decide? Or is this something that would be better off done by the legislature? And sometimes there's good reason to think that it's better for the legislature to address a problem, just because it's a lot easier for them down the road to make tweaks, adjust programs that aren't working quite exactly as intended, or if unintended consequences creep up. It's a lot easier to fix things if it's done through the legislature than the ballot. But that being said, there are a number of issues that, both by just the California Constitution rules, need to be put on the ballot, and also are really important for everyone to get a say in. And so that's why we do have a number of ballot measures. The last question that I always ask myself, and I'd recommend you ask yourself too, is who put this measure on the ballot? Sometimes measures can be really confusing and hard to understand what's going on. And knowing which group put the measure on the ballot sometimes can give you a little bit of information about what really the intent of the ballot measure is. So that's one that I always look at, and I definitely recommend for you too. So now that we've done all of that, let's hop into the actual measures. So we're going to start out in Oakland and Alameda County and City. Going first into Alameda County Measure W, which would increase funding for homelessness programs by increasing the county's sales tax. So this measure would raise $150 million annually for homelessness services, which means housing assistance, mental health resources, and job training. And it pays for all of this with a 0.5-cent sales tax increase. We at TechEquity are supporters of this one because we think that, especially during the pandemic, which has both increased the number of our neighbors who become unhoused and decreased local governments' ability through their budgets to respond to that increased need, we need to look for additional funding sources to meet that. We do typically get a little concerned about sales tax because they can be regressive, and what regressive means is just that lower income people end up paying a greater share of their income for them. And that's because sales tax is on stuff you buy, and lower income people spend more of their income on stuff they buy rather than higher income people who can save. So as part of today's format, I'm going to give these quick intros, and then Megan and I are going to talk a little bit about them. So Megan has a couple of questions to ask me on this.
Yeah, so you mentioned that some people feel like this tax is regressive, and that's something that definitely came to mind for me, that everyone buys stuff, including low-income people, and so this could have the potential to make goods that are really vital and essential for every household even harder to purchase for low-income households. So what's the trade-off here? If we're going to see sales tax increase for everyone, how does that affect the lower end of the income spectrum?
Yeah, I mean, that's a real concern. And like I was mentioning, these taxes hit as a share of their income, lower income people more. The issue, though, is local governments are pretty limited in their ability to quickly raise additional money. We know through all of the work that we've done on the Prop 15 campaign that property taxes, which are one of the main sources for local governments, are severely limited because we're wasting almost $12 billion a year on tax breaks for corporations who don't need that money. So in the meantime, when the options are so limited, sales taxes tend to be kind of one of the only things that counties can do. And in this case, while it would be great if we had a revenue source that was more progressive, the need here is so large that we feel that it's very important to pass Measure W.
Got it. So it sounds like it's a little bit of a trade-off, but our hands are a bit tied in terms of the options that we have before us. One of the other things that I always have trouble wrapping my head around is the scale of the problem. $150 million sounds like it's a lot of money, but is it really enough to address the scale of the problem?
Yeah, so this actually is a lot of money relative to what Alameda County is spending on its homelessness services. So the county makes a 3-year plan for its homelessness services, and the budget for that is about $430 million. So this is a big chunk of money that we're talking about here that can really make a difference on the services that the county are providing. That being said, we always are looking for more sustainable funding streams for this type of for these types of services. And so, once again, we talk about it all the time, but Prop 15 is so important, and it touches on issues like this and many other ballot measures that don't necessarily immediately seem related. So I think it's really important to always mention that to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks so much for giving us the insights we need on Alameda County Measure W. For those of you all in the audience, if you have additional questions on this measure that we didn't address in our little chat here, feel free to drop those into the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen, and we'll circle back to those at the end of the webinar. But for now, I want to move on to the city of Alameda, which has a measure on the ballot, Measure Z. Can you give us the summary of that one, Ian?
Yeah, so this is a really exciting measure that Alameda, the city, is considering this election. And what this one would do, it would repeal an old apartment ban on Alameda. So I think it was back several decades ago, Alameda passed a law that essentially bans the construction of multifamily housing, which is apartments. Over the years, there have been a few exceptions found in that ban that allow for a very limited amount of apartments, but more or less, building apartments on Alameda is extremely difficult, if not like basically impossible. The other part that this measure touches is this density cap. And so density is just how many housing units you have on a particular area of land. And there's this very high, I guess it's not a high density, but it requires a lot of land per unit of housing, which means that even in the few places on Alameda where people can build apartments right now, it's usually not economically viable to do that because they can't put enough apartments in there to cover the cost of the project. So this one would address that too. We are strong supporters of Measure Z.
Thanks. Yeah, it seems like this is part of a sort of trend that we're really happy to see of cities upzoning. There's been a bunch of recent examples in Minneapolis and Portland and other cities where they're eliminating this single family home only zoning. And what you just described about, how that limitation and only being allowed to build sort of your traditional, single family detached home creates a lot of expense. I mean, you think about, the parcel of land has to be of a certain size. If you make zoning requirements like, the front door of the home has to be X number of feet away from the sidewalk, which, creates a lot of sort of wasted space that wouldn't exist if you're building an apartment complex. One of the things that we haven't touched on with Measure Z is the implications for diversity and the racial justice implications of zoning. I think we all know that, having dense housing and having apartment buildings makes apartments more affordable and also has impacts on the environment, sustainability-wise, especially if they're close to transit. But can you talk about the impacts for diversity in neighborhoods and racial justice?
Yeah, it's extremely important to talk about racial justice issues when looking at measures like Measure Z. It's no accident that the apartment ban on Alameda made housing more expensive, which limited who could buy homes there. There was clear intent with passing that ban back in the day to exclude people of color and other low-income potential residents. And that's just something that's unacceptable. And so this is a chance for voters in Alameda to finally take a stand against that ugly history and get that racist ban off of the books.
Awesome. Well, really excited to see how things shake out with Measure Z. But now we're going to move on to the city of Oakland. So again, if you have questions about Alameda's Measure Z, please drop them in the chat box. And if you're an Oakland voter, it's time for your ears to perk up. Don't worry, Berkeley folks and folks in other parts of the East Bay, we're going to get to you later. But I'm sure you have some friends in Oakland, so you probably want to continue to pay attention so you can pass the along